One of the big areas where we looked for accessibility was in terms of our virtual learning environment. When we just selected a new virtual learning environment there recently, and we went with this new system called Brightspace. And one of the key kind of features or kind of components as to why we selected that tool was how accessibility was kind of embedded within its infrastructure. And we've also added a kind of an add-on to that virtual learning environment called Blackboard Alley, which allows lecturers and staff on campus to assess how accessible their course content is, but it also has that added bonus of being able to allow the students to download their content in a different format. So if someone wants it, say, if it's put up as a Word document, they can download it as maybe a PDF or an audio file or in a different format that best suits them. So we saw that, and I think that ties in nicely with what we're talking about in terms of, UDL and multiple means of representation. And so for us, the VLE was a good part of that, because that's kind of central to kind of the curriculum and how we and how kind of our whole system is structured here at UL. The other thing that we think is really important in terms of for UDL and accessibility to embed, we really need to have that buy-in. And we used to see a lot before around this kind of top-down approach where it's senior management buy-in, but experience has shown us that it's not just that top-down kind of approach. We also need that bottom-up where you have that student voice, that kind of student agency, and allowing them to advocate for themselves. But we also saw that, through things like communities of practice, how important that kind of middle out peer kind of support is in terms of, best practice about, having that expertise in troubleshooting about, knowing what works and what doesn't work. So for us, when we're talking about, whether it's accessibility, we talk about UDL, we're talking about that kind of joint up thinking where it's top down, bottom up, middle out kind of approach all together. And that's, for us, that's the only really way you can kind of embed this kind of inclusive education that we want. For us, we talked about, communities of practice and important, but, this whole idea of collaboration and sharing is so important and too. Too often in higher education, you kind of see these silos that kind of prevent and block this kind of cross communication. So what we're talking about here really is that kind of wider institutional approach where, at the heart of it, you've got our Centre of Teaching and Learning, but they're working with our educational departments, with our librarian services, with our disability support services, with our kind of accessibility services across the board. So it's kind of you approach it in a kind of cohesive way so that you're addressing all that and you're bringing it up. And what it does is it kind of feeds into, I guess, more of an inclusive culture. And that's kind of our overall aim is about, providing that inclusivity across the board, and not just for particular cohorts, but for every student. For me, I guess UDL is really, it's that flexibility and that inclusion. So it's about giving that choice and giving, understanding that diversity that we have in our student population, and it's about accommodating for that. And for me, I guess coming from a disability background, I always see that accessibility front and center as part of it. So for me, it's about that flexibility, it's about understanding that variability, and it's having things like accessibility, which benefit much more than students with disabilities. And I guess that's kind of where I see it. And I don't really talk as much about those multiple means of representation, action and expression, but more about, that practicality of how this is going to be implemented, how is this going to work, what are we doing to make this more inclusive, are we thinking about this type of learner when we're designing our material. So I guess that's kind of where I see kind of UDL, or how I envision it, I guess. I guess the other thing as well that we talk about UDL is about, how what we're trying to do is break down barriers. We, as I mentioned earlier, we talk about this, diversity we have in our student population, and there are lots of barriers, some intentional, some created by systems, some created by the very nature about how we design our curriculum. So it's about creating that awareness around where those barriers are and how we can remove them. So that plays a real important part in, creating that inclusive culture, identifying those barriers and finding strategies and ways to remove them.